All right, it's a few minutes after 5:30, so we'll get this thing started. Thank you everyone for joining us. Looks like we're getting participants streaming in from near and far, up to already almost 100 folks joining us, and that's really wonderful. My name's Matt Hart. I work for Vital Ground, and we're really delighted to be joined tonight by Rob Chaney and Bryce Andrews, two local Montana authors, and Kevin Rhodes from Vital Ground is also behind the scenes doing the admin side. So thanks, Kevin. And we just are excited to have our community of followers gather wherever you know us from or know Bryce and Rob from. It's great to have you joining us on a nice spring evening here in Montana. The way our webinar will work tonight, I'm just going to give a really quick introduction here to both of the authors and give each of them a chance to talk about and potentially read from their two recent books about bears. And then we'll have a little follow-up discussion and open it up for audience Q&A. So if you have a question as the evening goes on, please feel free to submit those via the Q&A function on Zoom. Kevin will be in the background sorting through those questions, and we anticipate some good ones. So if we don't manage to get to yours in the time we have this evening, we do have emails as part of your registration, and if it's something we can answer via an email, we'd be happy to follow up with you. So we'll get going now that I've mentioned all that. I'm guessing most of you know a little bit about Vital Ground already, but if you're just a Rob or Bryce fan who's never heard of this organization until tonight, I'll give you the very short elevator pitch. Vital Ground's based here in Missoula. We work throughout Montana and Idaho and Wyoming and Washington a little bit as well. And we're a land trust that works to conserve habitat in linkage areas for grizzly bears and for everything that shares their range, whether it's elk and wolves or the smaller guys like fish and frogs and even the plants. So we're out there to protect the wild things in the grizzlies range. And part of our mission is also to spread awareness about grizzlies and about grizzly recovery. And so we love hosting events like this every so often. It's been a while since we were able to have one in person, but we're excited to have Rob and Bryce joining us virtually and have you all joining us. And we hope to do a few more of these, both virtually and in person, as we move into the next phase of reopening wherever we are. So that's Vital Ground. Now we'll turn to our guests this evening and give you a quick introduction to the two of them. So Rob Chaney, Rob will be speaking first. And Robert Chaney, he's the author of, brought my show and tell, The Grizzly in the Driveway, The Return of Bears to a Crowded American West. It just came out in January of this year. And Rob is from Western Montana. He spent most of his journalism career writing about the Rocky Mountain West and its people and their environment. He's won numerous awards for his writing and photography, including fellowships at the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard and the National Evolutionary Science Center at Duke. Rob's a reporter here in town for the Missoulian, and he covers science and the environment.
Really happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Bryce Andrews is the author of Down from the Mountain. Its subtitle is The Life and Death of a Grizzly Bear. Came out in 2019. Bryce's first book is called Bad Luck Way, A Year on the Ragged Edge of the West. Came out in 2014. And that one won the Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers Award and the Reading the West Book Award, and was a finalist for the Washington State Book Award. And Bryce, when he's not writing books, is working with people in Carnivores, a partner organization of Vital Ground, and he lives on a farm just outside Missoula near Arlee, Montana. So welcome, Bryce.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
And before I turn it over to our authors, just to plug, you can get either of these books at your local bookstore. If they don't have it in stock, they should be able to order it for you. If Amazon is your preferred method, I will note that you can use the Amazon Smile function to support Vital Ground while you shop on Amazon, with a tiny portion of your purchase supporting grizzly bear conservation. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Rob first to let you all know what his book is about, and we'll hear about grizzlies and driveways and other great things. So Rob, it's all yours.
My pleasure, Matt. Thank you, and thank Vital Ground very much. It's really a honor to be sharing a screen with Bryce, whose own books, Bad Luck Way, got me really thinking about the stories that we've got to tell out here in the Mountain West. And the way he did it was just so much fun to read. I thought, I don't belong on the same field, but we'll try anyway. I have been chasing bears in books around since my grandmother gave me this old classic. This is William Wright's book from 1909 about the grizzly bear. And he was worried back then that he wouldn't have any grizzlies to show his grandchildren because we were losing them so fast. And I got to working on this project in part because I realized that I had been in the news business now at that time for about 25 years. And I was at these interagency grizzly bear committee meetings, and all of the same people were always there. And at one meeting, they all started retiring. And they were joking with each other about how we were all grad students together in Chuck Jonkel's bus going off to the North Border Grizzly Project back in 1980, whatever. And I saw this sort of generational shift moving out that had spent their entire careers from when the grizzly was put on the endangered species list back in 1975 until 2015, 2016, when they were all retiring and winding up, and the bear was still kind of in the same limbo. And the more I got to thinking about that, the more I sort of realized that things had this very funky perspective issue about where you stood when you were thinking about bears. And here's an example that I like to use. This is a little carved grizzly bear that somebody gave me a while back. But you turn it over and it's a spirit bear. And the more you read about bears, the more you realize that nobody has the same perspective on what they are and what you imagine about them, whether it is a 500-pound omnivore that lives in the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains, or it's a creature of imagination that lives in your fairy tales and your nightmares and your storybook beliefs. And so I started poking at that and just really realized how much difficulty we've got when we all decide that we want to figure out what to do with bears. We got to figure out what we mean when we're talking about bears. And so I just started chasing that around. And to begin at the very beginning with the cover here, this is my first book, and I didn't realize a whole lot about writing books. And one of them is that the author usually doesn't have any say over what the title's going to be. The marketing department works that out for you. And we were going round and round about what we were going to do for the title of this book when serendipity happened. In the same week as we were having this discussion back and forth, I heard two stories. One came out of Browning, Montana, where a rancher was complaining that when a grizzly bear shows up in a Glacier Park campground, the rangers come running out and haze it off. And if they can't haze it off, they trap it and haul it away somewhere where it's out of everybody's problem. But if a grizzly shows up in her driveway, it's her problem. And she wondered why that was fair, why nobody was helping her out with a giant predator, which at one point she said she thought was being brought into her house by the sound of a crying baby. And I thought that's a fairly provocative perspective on bears. A day later, I was talking with a friend who told me the story of the bear called Windfall. And this is over in Condon, Montana, in the Sealy Swan Valley, where a grizzly bear had been wandering into people's driveways and eating their garbage. And people were so thrilled with having this bear around. They were setting out their trail cameras and FaceTiming their friends to show that, look, I've got a grizzly bear in my driveway, and isn't it wonderful? And they were so in love with this bear that nobody reported it to the game wardens until it had become so habituated to human food that it was a serious danger to everybody, and it had to be killed. So I had two grizzly bears in two driveways with totally different perspectives, and all of a sudden the title just sort of fell into place, that this is our problem because grizzly bears are showing up in all of our driveways, and we are going to have to, in my case, the American people, because that's the ones that I participate with most, are going to have to make some decisions about how comfortable we are with that, how willing to share our environment we are, what sort of economic consequences we're willing to bear about bears, and who gets to make that decision. And so I just spent a couple of years poking around about how those decisions get made, and in some cases how we build on totally unfounded superstitions and imaginations great big scientific constructs about what we think we ought to be doing. And then you build into that the incredibly increasing tempo of decisions that are coming at us because of climate change, because of population growth, because of the way we are using our landscapes in opportunities that will not come back. We decide and you go from there, and you no gives backs, no redos, no mulligans. So we need to have a lot of good information, and we need to ask some really hard questions. I don't have a lot of the answers to these questions, but I really want to inspire the conversation, and I want to lay it down with as much research and as much wide-ranging perspective as I can, so that anybody who picks this up has a chance to say, okay, I see my frame of view carried in here, and now I can look through somebody else's frame as well. So with luck, that's what we did, and a lot of that had to do with the frame that Bryce put up in Down from the Mountain, which is, I cannot recommend enough. Bryce, to you.
Okay, well, that was a wonderful segue. Thank you, Rob. It's really interesting just to listen to you talk about this stuff because so much of the work that I do, both with people and carnivores, and also in the way that I assemble and write stories, it tends to focus in, narrower and narrower on a particular situation, a particular animal, a particular place, and then hopefully at the end of that make some sort of larger meaning of it. But it's really wonderful to get the chance to pull back and take more of like a high level view of some of these issues on the landscape. And so I'm really looking forward to reading your book and getting a chance to examine it that way and understand that different perspective on it. So I guess I want to start by, in the vein of what I just said, I want to start by telling a little bit of a personal story here. So I didn't set out to write a book about the state of things with the grizzly, in Western Montana right now. Instead, I took a job. I was born and raised in the urban heart of Seattle. And, I lived there until I was a creature that could make decisions for himself. And then at the earliest possibility, I paradoxically struck out eastward toward the west. I came out here to Montana, a place that I had visited and loved. And I took this job working on a ranch right on the edge of Yellowstone. It was up in the Madison Valley on the Sun Ranch. And I worked there, and I found it to be this mind-blowing thing, because I came with this whole set of sort of preconceptions, half-baked ideas about what it would be like to live and work within and beside a wilderness. And I found that some of those things were true. It's as I expected to. I loved the wild animals. I loved the opportunity to be outdoors and being in places that other people hardly ever saw. By the same token, though, I came to understand how difficult it can be to make your living on a landscape that includes large carnivores. And I did that for a while. I managed ranches for about 10 years, most of them in grizzly country. And at the end of that time, I ended up taking a job. So throughout that process, I was always sharing a landscape with bears, but they were always sort of on the edge of the world that I was moving in. I would be herding some cattle through a place, and you'd see a grizzly break out of the trees and sprint across a meadow and vanish again. Or I would come in and there'd be a grizzly that had scavenged a dead steer. So bears, wolves, mountain lions, they were always present in my world, but off to the side a little bit. But about 6 years ago, I made a change. I started working for this group called People and Carnivores, which is, as Matt said, it's a group that partners with Vital Ground to basically reconnect and restore the populations of large wild carnivores in our region. So what that means in practice, though, is that I was going out and dealing with a lot of people who were in the position that I had been in, which is the position of taking care of domestic animals and losing them to large carnivores and trying to cope with that. I was dealing with that, but then from the other side, looking to try to remedy or avoid some of those conflicts and figure out if there were ways for people and big carnivores to share the landscape in a way that involved less death and less violence and less conflict. That work is what took me to the Mission Valley. And the Mission Valley is at the center of Down from the Mountain. I went up there because People and Carnivores was looking to expand the scope of its work into this region, to do more with the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. And I went up there and I met with the bear biologist, then Stacy Corville, for the tribes. And Stacy, I remember sitting down with him in his office and asking Stacy, like, what are the big issues here? And Stacy looked at me and he said, corn and chickens. And that was an answer that I didn't expect. I was thinking cattle, I was thinking sheep, orchards maybe, but he said, you have to understand that these bears are totally opportunistic. And they come down from a set of mountains that are as wild as any you'll find in the world. The Mission Range is immense and impenetrable, and, seasoned mountaineers just absolutely get their asses kicked trying to climb it, and the bears thrive up there. But they come down into a valley floor that is intensively occupied and full of people, full of farms. And specifically, one of the things that Stacy drew my attention to was this situation at the base of the Mission Range, where a significant percentage of the valley's bears, like 25-30% of the known grizzlies in the valley, were coming down to a single cornfield that was right on the edge of the mountains. And Stacy showed me how that behavior was putting those bears at risk, because instead of being in the high mountains, where they could have, fed on natural food sources, they were being drawn down into this landscape where they would gorge on this crop, which was complicated because it helped them put on fat that they needed to last through winter, but it also made them critically morbidly obese, and it ruined their teeth. It did to them basically what corn syrup does to us. And so these bears would come in, they would eat all this corn, and they would stay in this field until the day the corn was cut. And Stacy said, we need to fix this. So I came up and began to work on this prototype of an electric fence that was meant to keep the bears out. And the whole idea of this fence was that it would be cheaper and more minimalist than bear fences that had been used in the past. It was only going to be 3 wires. It was going to be, a third or a quarter of the cost to build than a traditional fence. And I built this. I used the skills that I had built up as a ranch manager agricultural skills to build this fence. And then we began to monitor it and look at how bears were trying to get in. And man, they tried. I mean, they would walk the whole perimeter. You would see a bear, enter one camera, and then a quarter mile away, it's about a 90-acre cornfield. So it had about a 2-mile perimeter. Bear here, shows up on the next camera, all the way around. And that was really interesting. And some bears got in, most of them didn't. We cut the access to the field and the crop loss by about 75%, which is really significant. But what happened then is where the story, I think, gets particularly interesting, because one of these cameras picked up this grievously wounded grizzly bear, a bear that was known to biologists in the area because she had been collared and monitored some years back. It was a bear named Millie. And this bear had come down out of the mountains, had come into the field as she had been doing for more than a decade. And at some point, she had been shot in the face with a shotgun. And where the story goes from there is, I think, it's specific to this bear in this place. Millie ended up having to be put down. The reason that she was wounded like that was because she was so comfortable being in close proximity to people, which in turn was because of this crop. And because there were other folks in the area who were not securing attractants like garbage and carcasses and stuff like that. So the things we did ended this bear's life. And this was a bear that tried immensely hard to make a living in a landscape that we've modified a lot. So that's one animal story there. And that story is kind of at the heart of the book. But the part that really strikes me is about what that means in terms of how we use this landscape and what we leave available for bears. Because the truth of the matter here is that there will always be conflicts between large carnivores and human beings if we're trying to live from the same landscape. What I'm particularly concerned with is how many and what type. Because when you look at a bear like Millie, if we could protect that cornfield, if we could keep her from having that behavior, she's more likely to stay up in the high mountains. If she stays up in the high mountains, she's less likely to get into somebody's garbage bin. If she stays up in the high mountains, she's more likely to raise and bring to adulthood cubs that have that same behavior. And that part gets really interesting when you start thinking about where we are in the landscape. Because the Mission Valley and the Jocko Valley, where I live and farm, and even the Missoula Valley, we are at the far southern extent of this huge northern continental divide ecosystem. An ecosystem that is relatively speaking like where bears are thriving. But if you go south of here, you end up in a landscape where bears used to thrive in places like the Selway Bitterroot, the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness. Grizzly bears used to have a range that extended all the way to Mexico, all the way down in the Great Plains, out to the ocean in the west. I mean, it's amazing where they used to go. But if they are going to return to a lot of those areas, one of their best paths to that return runs right through this valley. And if the bears who are attempting that return, and Millie was one of them, as she came down out of the mountains, she started to move westward and south across the valley, she got stopped by that cornfield. She got stopped because that's where the food was, and she wanted to stay by the food. If we can avoid those outcomes and keep those bears moving so that they move through the areas where we're cultivating land and raising livestock, and they move on to the next wilderness, to me, that offers a tremendous amount of hope for the future. And that's what I really hope for. So what I wanted to do, just by way of closing up shop here, is I'm going to read you just a really a short, like, couple pages. It's excerpted from the book, but it's from a talk that I gave a little bit ago. But I'll just leave you with this. And to understand this passage, there's only one person that you have to know that I'll introduce to you now here. It's Jermaine White. And Jermaine was the outreach and education director for the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. She's a friend of mine and she's retired now, but was and remains a tremendously strong and articulate voice for the interests of the tribes and for animals like the grizzly. So I'll just read this to you, and that'll be the end of my little piece I want to say. Here's the thing. Grizzlies make tremendous efforts to stay alive in this valley, the Mission Valley. The challenges they face, whether human-caused or natural in origin, are worth attending to. It's worth us helping them where we can, and worth us recognizing that we and our creations, our cars and crops and garbage and livestock, are, by a very large margin, the most dangerous thing a bear can encounter in the modern landscape. The last 200 years were bad. Jermaine said that to me while we worked together to put a bear fence around the berry patch at her house, a fence meant to keep her plants and grizzlies separate and safe. It's up to us, she said, to make sure that the next 200 years are better. She meant that statement broadly, and she was right, both about the past and our responsibility to the future. But she also captured the way things stand for grizzlies and other wild creatures. The last 200 years have, taken as a whole, and in spite of a modest recovery in the past decades, been disastrous for bears, and we find ourselves at a decisive moment. Here is the hard truth. Even here, in this valley, we are very close to the point where there are too many houses and too many risks, too many unprotected garbage cans, cornfields, and chickens for grizzlies to thrive. We have already reached the point where humans, mostly accidentally, kill more grizzlies around here than anything else. I would argue, too, that we are close to the density at which people cease to thrive and be able to make their livings from the land, at which we begin losing our daily connection to the natural world. But that is the subject of another talk. We will remain with the bears. For them, this place is key. What the CSKT, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, have done to the south of here, with the tribal wilderness area and their management of it, is essential. We should all thank the tribes for that. Seriously, write them a note. What farmers and ranchers have done by keeping land open and undeveloped is also important. We should thank them too. Right now, bears can still move through the valley floor, surviving and crossing toward other landscapes where they've been missing for too long. It's hard, but they manage to do it. Anyone who has seen the data from their GPS collars will tell you that grizzlies own this valley at night. The paths they move on are dangerous and vulnerable, and bad decisions on our part will render them impassable. Subdivide the length of an essential creek, for example, and fill the yards with barking dogs, and bears will not travel that corridor anymore. Put more traffic on the highway, more unsecured trash on the porches, and far too many grizzlies will die. If we want grizzlies to thrive here and reoccupy more of their historic range, we must make their lives easier and keep them from dying so often at our hands. We can do this in small ways, by removing the temptations that get bears into trouble, by getting bear-resistant trash bins and putting up electric fences around our chicken coops and our pig pens. But we must tackle the problem in larger ways too, by defending and preserving undeveloped land and standing against subdivision and the fragmentation of important habitat. Never forget this. If we break this dream of a place into small enough pieces, if we fill it too full of our own structures and constructions, it will cease to sustain grizzlies and agriculture, both. And then it will no longer be the thing we love. Knowing this, we must use every tool, zoning, regulation, dialogue, easements, to ensure that one generation's whim or need does not seed another generation's ruin. Here is the heart of it. Seeing grizzlies thrive across a crowded West requires as much restraint as it does action. It means that we must, whether we are platting land for subdivision or traveling a highway after dusk, slow down. And then we will have to go further, finding a new gear, reverse, on a machine that we have been driving at breakneck speed for nearly 2 centuries in this region, breaking with one of the American West's fundamental traditions. We must be the first generation to leave this place less settled, and to my way of thinking, more whole than we found it. If we can manage that, I see a bright future for us and the bears. I see grizzlies moving south and west, finding their way back to places that were once home to them, enacting a return that reminds me of the salmon I grew up with on the Washington coast. The only difference is that the bears are pursuing that return on a massive scale, over generations, through the backyards, creek bottoms, and pastures of the place we call home. We owe it to them and to ourselves to help them make that journey. Thanks.
So Bryce, that passage boils down in scientific terms to two words: social tolerance. That's the actual term that's in the grizzly bear recovery plan for what we need to reach in order to declare the bear recovered. We need to find some level of social tolerance that everybody can buy into. And that same plan specifically states that there is no scientific way to measure social tolerance. So we essentially have to create a measuring stick or a compact, a social agreement to live with bears that we can't define, we can't measure, and we can't scientifically analyze. You spent a great deal of time literally in the dirt with people who were trying to decide what their tolerance for bears were. How do you, especially when you're trying to convince somebody to take on your services with people and carnivores, what do you see them bumping into that defines where they realize their social tolerance threshold is?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that there are two very different answers to it. You know, I mean, I'm sure there are more than two, but there's a difference between, okay, so social tolerance can stem from actual conflict, right? I mean, like if I've had my dogs chewed up several years in a row by grizzly bears, I will be less tolerant of having those bears on the landscape. And I have a very concrete good reason for it, which is that, you know, I've lost sleep and money and animals I care about. That's one thing. But then I think there's this whole other world which honestly makes up the larger portion of people's resistance to large carnivores, which is presumption of risk and inherited cultural biases. And so oftentimes, in terms of building that consensus that allows for that sort of tolerance, you first have to understand which of those two things you're dealing with, I think. And that's, and often it's a combination of them too. I mean, we talk a lot in People and Carnivores work about the Carnivore Gap, which a term we use to denote the time between the sort of like intensive government scale extermination programs that were carried out that artificially depressed the level of grizzlies, wolves, black bears, and lions in the West, and the present moment where we're seeing that resurgence. So there's about a 50-year gap there in the latter half of the 20th century where people got really used to the idea that you could turn livestock out and they would all come back at the end of the summer. You know, so like part of tolerance stems from that, is just like, we should be very honest about the fact that living with these large carnivores takes work, and it's more work to ranch. I can speak to this from personal experience, more work to ranch with them on the landscape than it's not. But, you know, I think it's a dark thicket that you're talking about here to walk into, because there are so many factors of both real conflict, perceived conflict, and myth that are all kind of stewing around. And I'll stop rambling here shortly, but the last thing I want to say about this is just that one thing I notice is when we go out to somebody's ranch or farm or home, if we provide them with trail cameras and they begin to watch these carnivores move across the landscape, and they see how often, for instance, they're there, but they don't cause a problem, that begins to change people's opinion of them in some cases. So a lot of this has to do with attention, with knowing what these animals are and what they do beyond those fairly rare moments where they're actually causing us trouble. I think that's part of the key.
I wanted to ask one other thing, given you both your time as a carnivore specialist, shall we say, and as a rancher. So I had a conversation with the county extension agent in north central Montana, who was very concerned that the Livestock Loss Board needed to get its financing up because grizzly bears were moving into central and eastern Montana. They were moving, which incidentally is their evolutionary playground. I mean, grizzly bears are not mountain animals in pre-human or at least pre-white settlement times. They're plains animals. So they're moving out towards the Malta area. And this guy says, there were 100, 120 cows killed last year by grizzly bears, and we need to get ready for this. And I said, last year in one storm, one blizzard, 12,000 cows were killed in Montana. And he said, yeah, 7,000 of them right here in Phillips County. And I said, then explain the business math for me. 120 cows killed by grizzly bears is a problem that we want major government action on. 7,000 cows or 12,000, depending on your point of reference, killed by weather is bummer, act of God. That's just cost of doing business. And his response was, we'll just have to agree to disagree. Now that I got you on the hot seat as both a carnivore person and a rancher, can you help me explain why the personal cost of losing a cow to a predator versus the abstract cost of losing a cow to the weather is so different?
Yeah. Okay. This is a classic way for me to get myself in trouble with like literally everybody involved in this. Here's what I would say. The difference between those two things is one of them, weather, poison, disease in the herd. These are risks that ranchers are raised raised and trained knowing that they're going to confront, and actually they are difficulties that agricultural communities often take pride in confronting. Like, you make it through the storm, that proves something about who you are. The same thing was true with predator control for a long time and remains that way to the same. So there's a different approach. Like, I've often thought, if I could convince other ranchers, people I know, to take the same approach to proactively trying to reduce the chance of conflict with big carnivores that they take to like herd health and genetics, like if you could get them to apply the same intensely intelligent, creative minds to proactive carnivore coexistence that is applied to other aspects of animal agriculture, we'd be way ahead. Because you're talking about a group of extremely hardworking, intelligent, creative people. And one of the things that's always seemed sort of interesting and sad to me is the fact that oftentimes that creativity, that strength of will and inventiveness is not applied to this issue. Here's what I would say about this too. And this is more, I have experience with this with wolves. There are costs inherent in losing an animal to large carnivores that go beyond the loss of that one animal. So there's stress on the herd, there's ways in which you have to change your management. And then there's also this larger like meta debate that's going on, because the thing that you're really agreeing to disagree with that guy, this is just my 2 cents here, but like the thing that we're really disagreeing about is who gets to say what happens to carnivores on private lands in the West. Because our precedent has largely been like, what happens on private lands is the right of the private landowner to decide. I think increasingly as a society, we're beginning to reassess that and say, ecology does not abide by those rules. and maybe our own law and legislation and stuff shouldn't either. So I mean, I think, the reason why those things are so thorny is because the issues underlying them go as deep as everything in the West. And like, I can honestly respect and understand both sides of that picture, because I have stayed up. Mostly the conflicts that I've had have been with wolves, but like as a ranch manager, I've had a whole month where I didn't sleep a full night's sleep because I was sleeping out with these herds and we're losing animals every day to wolves. And like by the end of that, you are in a place where like somebody coming in and asking you to think logic, like to ask you what's the difference between this and a lightning storm killing cattle, you say like, well, one of them is causing me to lose all this sleep and is stringing my cattle's entrails out across the prairie. And so like I really respect the difficulty of this. And I think what we need to do is, where agriculturalists are willing to try to live with these animals, we have to incentivize that. So like, I think that having the Livestock Loss Board is a really good thing. And I think we should keep doing it. Even if, even if what you said about the different sources of loss, logically, that makes all the sense in the world to me. Like I'm right there with you. At the same time, I think anything we can do to sweeten the deal for people who are living on these really fine margins, and where this could tip that margin one way or the other, I think is worth doing.
All right. Matt, I think we got some questions rolling in.
Yeah, we do. Thanks for a really, really great conversation so far, guys. Rob, we do have a request for you to read something from the book too. So maybe you can leave us with that after a few questions, if there's a passage that you're willing to read. But we'll take a question from Kathy first that's nice and specific. Are there plans for the federal government to stop or limit the leasing of federal land for cattle and sheep ranches that are in Grizzly range? If either of you want to take that one on. We've been talking a lot about private lands, but this is actually, I'll chime in very briefly. This is something Vital Ground partnered on a number of years ago now, were lease retirements outside of Yellowstone, grazing lease retirements. And so I don't know if either of you have more experience with that more recently, but I know it is something that various groups have been working on.
So if I'm following right, she's not talking about government taking over ranches, but changing the rules for grazing leases that ranches had leased and run their cattle on public land.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, that's been fairly active in Southwest Montana in the Centennial Range. They just got around to pulling off some big sheep grazing allotments down there. It's moved just in the other direction in Wyoming. I just heard a couple days ago that, in fact, the Bighorn sheep people were very upset about some new sheep grazing allotments in Wyoming that had been returned to domestic livestock, and they were afraid they were going to lose the bighorns that they planted there. So that's a thing going back and forth. Bryce, do you recall last year somebody in Congress tried to pass legislation that was going to make leases, grazing leases, a 20-year re-up with no questions asked sort of policy? And I can't remember if that got locked in or not.
I don't know either. I do know that it's just an incredibly contentious thing. I think that retiring some of those leases probably makes a ton of sense. But also, I know people who depend entirely on the ability to run cattle on leased land in those landscapes. So again, yeah, it comes back to, it's really tricky, and it comes back to, if the benefit and the burden of doing these things falls unequally on different people, and how do we as a society attempt to even that out? How do we do those things? But I don't know. I can't add much on the policy side.
Great. We'll take a look at a question from Donna, who's wondering, about connectivity corridors and what the latest knowledge is about how much they're being used, and whether that is increasing the diversity of grizzly gene pools. And I will say from a vital ground angle, we do know there is some movement going on, more movement in the last few years between the small populations in the Selkirk and Purcell Mountains. And we were excited to learn that Wayne Casworm, who is the Fish and Wildlife Service head up in that part of the state, he does have documentation of a bear moving from the small Cabinet Mountain population up into the Yak area.
That's neat.
Near Vital Grounds Wild River Project up there. So those are individual cases. It's not enough for anyone to, declare a big increase in genetic diversity, but they're encouraging signs. And I don't know what either of you have heard lately on that front.
Well, I could just add, just through People in Carnivore's work, we're seeing more activity in the big hole, to the point where sometimes people aren't really sure whether they've come from whether the grizzlies have come from the Yellowstone population or the NCDE. There's a ton more activity moving down into the sort of Deer Lodge Butte, that area. So we're and of course we've seen a couple of bears make the crossing between the NCDE and the Selway Bitterroots. So we are seeing those dispersers making those crossings, and hopefully that will begin to contribute to some genetic interchange in those populations. That stuff is really promising. It's really fun to track some of these animals and just see the journeys they make.
Yeah, that's going to be, I think, the crucial both scientific and legal challenge. That was the real crux of the 2017 delisting rule getting thrown out of court, was what I've come to describe as a catch-22. The connectivity issue that the judge pointed to was, on the one hand, if you say that rule only delisted the bears in the greater Yellowstone area, it created what was called a distinct population segment. So that meant all the other bears in the Northern Continental Divide and the Cabinet Yak and the Selkirks were another population segment. And the judge said, one of two things has to happen. Either you have to be able to show that all of those bears, including those tiny populations in the Cabinet Yak and the Selkirks, can survive without being connected to the Yellowstone bears, which there's a whole lot of science saying, no, you need that genetic interchange. You need to keep things going back and forth, or you're going to have serious genetic problems, not to mention environmental problems. Or you've got to say that the bears have to be able to move back and forth, in which case, why did you carve the Yellowstone out as a separate population? And you got this, it's can't be one thing or the other, and it can't be both. And the way that the government's lawyer flummoxed on that in the courtroom was pretty funny to watch, because he realized that they had boxed themselves in a corner on this. Where they're going to go, the modeling that they've done shows that bears are bears. They will do what they want to do and not what we were hoping they would do. So the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, that's Canada to Missoula, essentially along the Continental Divide, and the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, they're 70 miles apart at their closest points. They're from like Lincoln to I think the edge of Dillon is sort of where the boundaries are. But bears don't go through there, because that means you have to get through Helena and Butte, and bears don't do that. They go clear the heck out into the Big Snowies and do this great big long roundabout loop, or they come down into the Big Hole in southwestern Montana and do a totally different great big roundabout loop. They do not take the most convenient way, and the way that we might be able to set up a bunch of underpasses and bear transport corridors that would be convenient for us. They're going to do it their own way. And in the process, they might decide that the big hole's way more interesting than the Greater Yellowstone. Why bother going all the way and having to put up with those tourists? The big hole isn't a recovery zone. Is it okay to have bears there? We haven't made that decision. We have just made a decision, we being in this case Montana legislature, that a bear that is captured in a outside of a recovery zone may not be transported if it is part of a conflict situation. That is to say, if a bear is threatening somebody's livestock and they catch it in a culvert trap, Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks can't move that bear. And the Fish and Wildlife Service, the federal agency, does not have enough personnel to come down and get that trap and move it, which means that the bear is likely going to have to be killed in the driveway. Or we have to change that law. And that gets at the way bigger issue, which is if the federal government is going to delist those bears, it has to do a thing called show that there is adequate regulatory mechanism, a great big bureaucratic term. Basically, it means the states are prepared to protect bears. And the Montana legislature in the last session just pretty much undermined any credibility they had with the federal government with a series of laws that show that we are not prepared to protect bears to a federal standard. And so the feds are going to say, yeah, I guess we are not going to delist.
Yeah, it's such a web of different jurisdictions and different management approaches. We got a good, pretty specific question that maybe we'll let Bryce take the first crack at. This comes from a friend of Vital Ground, Mary Sexton, who is talking about the Rocky Mountain front where Mary lives. Hi, Mary. And she's noting that some ranchers have learned to live with bears over the past 20 years on the front, but now they are roaming farther east, and they're encountering farms with grain bins, grain, sunflowers, and lots of farmsteads. So it seems that management tools and education are evolving to deal with different ag situations. But Mary's wondering, what are some of these new situations and the new tools? And Bryce, if you have done any work yet, or others at PNC with North Central Montana farming communities.
Yeah, and I apologize in advance. I've got a young cow dog here who's occasionally taking offense at the rainstorm going through. So if there's barking, I'm sorry. So the short answer is that we don't work as much as I would like to in North Central Montana and on the front, and that's purely a matter of resources and staffing. What I do know is that although that region presents certain unique challenges that have to do with how thoroughly the portions of the land out from the mountains is being farmed, a lot of the same tools that we're using all over the state are relevant there. So, where the issues are between livestock and bears, livestock guardian dogs, night penning, the use of scare devices, all those things, none of it's surefire, but to see greater acceptance of that and greater use of that across the landscape will continue to make a big difference. And I think it already is for some people. Where the issue is crops, and that's by far, I think, the more intractable issue, where bears are feeding on grain crops, other row crops. That's really, really tricky, because you can't do what we did in the Mission Valley on 2,000 acres of dryland wheat. You cannot practically fence bears out of those crops. Nor do you really want to, because if you begin to checkerboard the landscape with fences that are non-permeable for bears, that presents its own suite of issues. So I don't I mean, I wish I had better answers in terms of specific tools and practices. All I can go back to is the fact that, we do have some very effective tools on the landscape, in the form of electric fence, guard dogs, tracking and trail cameras that are making people safer and limiting conflict. And I think that that's really our best bet out there. But it all comes back to what Rob raised about this issue of social tolerance and figuring out how we collectively, and particularly the people who live in north central Montana, like, to what degree can we coexist in those landscapes with these animals? I hope we can. But it's something that I feel like we should discuss openly and decide, as a broad swath of people with a stake in the issue. So I hope that was enough of an answer, but that's all I got.
I'll just add one quick thing here. See if I can get this to show. So when you're talking about bears moving around in Montana, let's see if I can get this in the right space here. So if we've got our bears up here that are fooling around in Bryce's territory, and they move down into the Bitterroot, that's this range right here. And in the eastern Montana, you've got bears up here on the Rocky Mountain front, and they are zooming all the way out to Havre and Malta. They're getting clear out into this territory. And people think, wow, these are the super bears. They must be really rocking. What you're not realizing is, again, what I said earlier, bears are a plains animal, and they are moving out on river corridors. They're not, taking up this entire space. They are following essentially bear highways, which would take them out into someplace like the Missouri Breaks, which is actually ideal grizzly territory. That's where Lewis and Clark first started running into them on a regular basis. So I'm looking at an email right now from one of my colleagues at the Montana Standard that they just captured a bear in Avon and euthanized it because it was getting into killing some yearlings there. But we're going to be seeing them moving, more and more places and showing up as an issue in more and more backyards and neighborhoods for people who, to take that Grizzly Gap, the Carnivore Gap, had grown up going with grandpa to a fishing hole for 50 years, that all of a sudden you're kind of scared about sending your kids to because there might be a bear there now.
Certainly a new set of challenges for folks who have been living out there. We had a question about tribal land, which I think is an important perspective and an important thing to remember, that bears and tribes have been living together for a long time. And one of the questions is if there has been any work between government agencies, state, federal agencies, and tribal wildlife agencies about moving problem bears onto tribal lands when they're larger expanses. The questioner gave the example of the Bighorn Mountains, where there's not currently a grizzly population, or at least not a large one.
Well, I don't know. I can't speak to the Bighorns. All I can say is that from working closely with the CSKT Natural Resources Department, I can tell you that they coordinate with federal, with state managers. I mean, there's very close coordination between all those parties, and I don't think there's anything that would stop, moving, like in this part of the world anyway. If there was a bear that needed to be relocated, and the tribal natural resources folks approved of it, I see no reason why it couldn't go, in the Upper Jocko or something like that. I know that coordination's there, but I think that's a question that you'd have to ask individually to each tribal government. And I'm sure it's very different when you're talking about a reservation or a mountain range that doesn't currently have a population of bears. I imagine then it would be much more of a fraught conversation.
It's also much more of a legal conversation than a biological one. I mean, there's a whole lot of biological reasons why, various places, including most of Montana's Indian reservations, would be ideal habitat for bears. But there is a gigantic legal brief that did not get heard in the 2017 case, presented by a consortium of tribes and tribal leaders and tribal members, arguing that they had spiritual and cultural and religious claims on grizzly recovery that were not being respected. And they have sovereign nation rights and legal religious preservation rights, which are going to run right into hunter harassment rights. Montana and Idaho and Wyoming all have laws that you cannot interfere with somebody taking a legal big game animal. But if I am a tribal member and I think that that bear is part of my spiritual universe, and I get in front of somebody's gun, is this a First Amendment issue or a Second Amendment issue? It's going to be really ugly. There's also a treaty compact among tribes and tribal representatives that I think at the last count had 270 signers from tribes all the way down to the Mexican border, all saying, we want to see the bear recovered, and if possible, we'd like to have a few. Again, that's more of a legal than nobody's preparing to haul Yellowstone grizzly bears down to New Mexico, but they have said in writing that they'd be more than happy to have them.
Yeah, important perspectives. So we're up. We've used up our hour that was scheduled for it. We've got a few more good questions coming in. Bryce, Rob, if you're game, we can take a few more, but no worries if
I've got time.
Other places to be.
I can stay a little bit. I want to hear Rob read a little chunk at the end, though.
There we go. Well, one question that has shown up in a couple different iterations is about crossing structures, helping the bears cross the road, so to speak, and wondering where crossing structures may be in the works. Some specific mentions from one commenter about connecting the Sapphire and Bitterroot ranges in Ravalli County, or farther north connecting to the Bitterroots over by St. Regis, or down in the Deer Lodge, Whitehall area, getting closer to Yellowstone. So a couple very interesting corridor spots there. I don't know, have either of you heard of crossing structure projects in the works?
I'd be curious to hear you talk a little bit, because Vital Ground purchased that chunk of land just adjacent to 90. Could you tell us a little bit about that and how that relates to the crossing issue?
Yeah. So Bryce is referring to the 9 Mile area, about 20 miles west of Missoula. Am I right? That's the one you're thinking of, mm-hmm. Bryce? Yeah. And we've called that the Bridge to the Bitterroots project. And it really is kind of a Goldilocks project in terms of location and infrastructure, because on the chunk of habitat that Vital Ground purchased, there is an existing route underneath